everyone, and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Tom Lonergan, your host for this presentation. Before we get started, a quick plug to support the authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful book-selling partner, Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. We have links to purchase in the presentation description. Given all we've been through over the past year, it is so important to support local jobs and the local economy. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's get started. Today we have with us two buzzworthy authors here to discuss their new novels, both of which use the backdrop of Brooklyn to tell stories of being young and Black in America. Black Buck by Mateo Askaripour is a hilarious, crackling debut novel that explores ambition and race. Mateo is a Brooklyn-based writer. He was a 2018 Rhode Island Writers Colony writer-in-residence, and his writing has appeared in Entrepreneur, Lit Hub, Catapult, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. When No One Is Watching by best-selling author Alyssa Cole is an intense psychological thriller in which the gentrification of a Brooklyn neighborhood takes on a sinister new meaning. Alyssa is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of romance and thrillers. Her espionage romance, An Extraordinary Union, was the American Library Association's Rusa Best Romance for 2018, and her novel, A Princess in Theory, was one of the New York Times' 100 notable books of 2018. Moderating the discussion between this powerful duo will be Nick Kolakowski. Nick is the Derringer Award-nominated author of Maxine Unleashes Doomsday and Boise Long Pig Hunting Club, as well as Love and Bullets trilogy of novellas. He lives and writes in New York City. Welcome, Mateo, Alyssa, and Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with everybody.
Same.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's get to it. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm hoping that we can kick off a pretty lively discussion about some very big issues. So I don't want to sort of create too much of a tennis match back and forth, but I did have some questions for your individual books, and I was hoping that we could get into that and then sort of hopefully kind of kick off a broader discussion, kind of with some nice dialogue. And the first one went to Alyssa. I loved When No One Is Watching. And the thing that I was sort of curious about was that you're a master of all these different genres. And when it came time to do this particular narrative with these huge issues related to gentrification and everything else, you chose a thriller format, which I thought was, I mean, I tore through the book in a day, and usually I don't do that with books. And so, I mean, definitely from kind of a reader standpoint, I thought it was excellent, but I was just kind of wondering, what were your considerations in choosing kind of a thriller as your vehicle for talking about kind of all of these concerns and these issues related to gentrification and everything else?
Thank you, first of all. But for why I chose a thriller, gentrification is something I have been wanting to write about for a long time. And I kind of started touching on it in a romance I had started writing that was set not in Brooklyn, but was set in Scotland. And it's like, the thing is, in that book, it's a romance, and the heroine is finding herself and discovering she has ADHD. The hero is the secret love child of a duke. There is all of this other stuff going on. So I started putting in the things like, someone is buying stuff, and it does lead into why he decides to accept, his dukeship. But someone is buying property in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is starting to change, and issues of immigration and stuff like that. But because in a romance, the driving force, even though it can be about anything and being in any setting, the driving force is the relationship between the two protagonists. And it was really hard to delve as deeply as I wanted to into the gentrification issue, and also handle all of the other threads that were going in the story. And for me, there's just kind of this, so I'm from New York. I don't live in the US right now, but I am from New York. I was born in the Bronx, and then I did cross the river to Jersey City. I'm not gonna lie. So I'm also a Jersey, I straddle the Hudson. Then after college, I lived in Brooklyn for most of my adult life until I moved to Martinique. And one of the things that I would see both in Brooklyn and in Jersey City when I went to visit my family, well, it was a bit more advanced in Brooklyn, and then like going to Jersey City would be seeing like the beginning of it. So, you know, seeing all of these buildings going up and like just who is going to live in all of these buildings, number one, and just seeing things changing so rapidly, then going back and visiting my family and suddenly there's a huge condo, the video store isn't there anymore, like all of these new bars are popping up, and then going back on the train to Brooklyn, and even in my neighborhood there new, you know, the old barber shop is closing and suddenly there's like a boutique, and like so just kind of I was thinking about it in the form of a cycle, like in some ways you start to be like, am I losing it? Wasn't that thing just there? How much time has passed since that place closed? And kind of, I don't know, the unsettling nature of like your community just kind of disappearing right in front of your eyes and changing so quickly, and also the kind of powerlessness that comes with that. And I thought a thriller would be a good way of kind of conveying that, and like with a bit of horror too.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the paranoia like just sort of breathes through every page in that, and exactly what you're saying. The Sydney, the main protagonist, like kind of, you know, did this actually happen? Did this not happen? And kind of, yeah, builds up that this whole almost thunderhead of suspense. One question sort of related to that. I'm desperately not trying to spoil anything, but there's a shadowy organization behind the book's events. Which actually might have been too much of a spoiler, but okay. But anyway, I was just curious. I mean, in terms of real life incidents, real life kind of inspiration for things, was there anything sort of specific you were pulling at, or was it just sort of an aggregation, I guess you would say, of kind of everything that's going on with gentrification and all the rest of the things in Brooklyn right now?
It was an aggregation. It was a little bit based in Amazon, you know, trying to place their new headquarters in Queens, and also just kind of a little bit based in Disney, which has a lot of real estate. You know, we always think of like movies and things like that, but just kind of how these organizations always kind of have these other tendrils that are involved in other things that we don't really even think about, and have like a lot more power than we think about. Like if we look at this week and talking about voting rights, and there are like press releases from Delta talking about voting rights, I'm like, what was Delta doing consulting with these politicians? And like, so just things like that. I guess I was just thinking about corporations in general and kind of the powers they can have without us ever really thinking about it.
I wish I could spend a few hours in your mind, Alyssa. It's just the patterns and connections, just seeing you speak about all of it. I like it. I dig it.
Thank you.
Mateo, in terms of digging into your mind, Mateo, I mean, as part of the research of this panel, I was reading your interview in the LA Times where you talked about how you sought out a career in startup sales, then became disillusioned, and then in that interview, you talked about how Black Buck draws from that experience, although it's not strictly autobiographical. And I kind of wanted to dig more into that and sort of talk about, you know, what about that early career sort of led you to sit down and write the book? Kind of like,
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I was just so entrenched in the world of startups and sales that it's all I knew for many years. I'm going to say intentionally, I suppose, even though I might have not been as conscious about it back then, but I intentionally distanced myself from the people who loved me unconditionally and were closest to me in my life. Best friends, my family, other people who I felt just didn't get it, right? I was in this world of startups and sales. I was rising. You know, by the time I was 24, I was managing 30 people and making over 6 figures. So I had friends that would look at me and say, come hang out with us, come see us. My mother would call me and I would screen her calls because I felt as though they just didn't really get it, which in a way illustrates that there's a fine line between cult and culture, right? Culture or culture fit. Talking about how, you know, Alyssa brought up Amazon and some of these organizations, there's just a fine line and lines are blurred. And I look to do the same in my book, knowing that it would be risky because people would have a hard time knowing what was real, what was more satirical than absurd, and what was more sincere than hyperbolic. But I was okay with that because I wanted to put the responsibility on the reader to come to their own decisions, and to look at themselves and say, how does this feel to read this? How am I thinking about all of this? In terms of my own life, right? I worked at a startup for many years. And then, as you brought up before, Nick, I became disillusioned. So for me, I turned to writing as an outlet. But it's not like I just began writing fiction. I began writing articles and essays that were related to the worlds that I knew, startups and sales. And then it was later in 2016 when I turned to fiction, and I realized writing for me, when it came to fiction, wasn't just an outlet, but also a very specific form of salvation. So I wrote one manuscript, didn't work out. I'm not going to tell the whole story just because it goes on and on. Wrote another, didn't work out. And when I was at what I would call creative rock bottom, I was reading On Writing by Stephen King, which many people have read, right? And it's gotten them out of a rut, and it helped me as well. And he says that the way that I write all of my books, talking about a guy who wrote, thrillers, is that I get my characters into scenarios, and then I figure out how to get them out of those scenarios over the course of a couple hundred pages, or I don't. And I said, okay, I can think of some scenarios, close to my life. And at the same time, I was breaking away from trying to pander to the industry. So I said, okay, I need to write the book that I want in the way that I want to serve the people that I want. And what are some themes that I have felt as though I haven't been competent enough or skilled enough to discuss yet? And it was the intersection of sales, startups, and race. So I began Black Buck. And it was very important for me to know that while I was drawing from parts of my own experience inside and outside of the workplace, I wasn't writing about my own life. I couldn't just write about my own blow-by-blow history, because then I wouldn't have the necessary distance to go the places that I wanted to go and to write a story that I hoped would serve people in the way that I wanted to serve them.
So the cool thing about the book, I thought this was extraordinarily innovative, and it almost reminded me of kind of how a nonfiction book would do it, which I guess might have been the direct inspiration. But you have these call outs throughout the text where you give sales advice and things like that. And both of your books have been huge successes. I'm just wondering, have people come up to you and said, hey, I applied the practical knowledge and this is the result, this is what happened? I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, in terms of like reader usage of all this valuable information that you give through the book.
Oh yeah, they have, and it's just like I want to jump for joy every time I see a tweet like that or get a message where people say, "Hey, I applied some of these tips in my own role, and it helped me, advocate for myself better, or speak up in a meeting, or this, that, and the other." For me, it's a big win, and the surprising thing, even though I hoped for it, is that it wouldn't just be for people who are working at startups or in workplaces. I've had people who worked in medical fields say, this has helped me, advocate for a patient better, or for, myself in a certain setting, people who are teachers. So it's been a big win, but I very intentionally so wrote this book so that it wouldn't just be an engaging narrative, but that it would also double as a sales manual. So you brought up, nonfiction books and sales manuals as potentially being the inspiration, and they partially were. When I got into the game of sales, I was handed two books written by a man named Jeffrey Gitomer. It was the Little Red Book of Selling in the Sales Bible. And these books were they were cloth wrapped, but they were glossy and they were beautiful. No nonsense, no BS. This guy saying, you want to do well in sales, this is what you got to do. So I remembered that. I carried that with me. I'd also read years ago, Mohsen Hamed's How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, where at the beginning of every chapter or part is a rule or a maxim, stash away some money, learn how to get dirty, get in with bureaucrats. And then it was while I was querying and pitching my book, or it was after the third draft of Black Buck, that I was reading Mitchell S. Jackson's The Residue Years. And in that, he breaks the fourth wall and says, people. And that when he's writing people, he's addressing the reader. So it was the intersection of all of those works over years that just bubbled up in me at that point and said, okay, I know that I want this to be perceived also as a sales manual. Why don't I just break the fourth wall very conspicuously so that it's very blatant what I'm looking to do here? And fortunately, it's worked out, but I'm not going to sit here and say everyone's feeling it. Some people aren't.
Just Darren, the main character, like he encourages people to occasionally do the homework assignments, like some truly kind of big crazy things, which is, I mean, and it's a lot of fun to read those sequences, and some like the per se sequence and so on are
Yeah.
like really like, I mean, it's hilarious. I mean, it's really funny. I mean, has
I had to cut
anybody?
some out.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's I assume those parts are kind of did any of that actually happen in real life, or is that all stuff that like kind of the crazier things? I'm just curious. I mean,
No.
that was fun.
No, it makes me laugh because I'm trying to picture like what that would have been like in real life. None of
Could have
those
been
things,
insane.
yeah, none of those things actually did happen. But when I was working at the startup that I was at, and even afterwards, right? Like I worked with different organizations. You see what we could call euphemistically shenanigans. And these shenanigans take on many different forms and shapes and textures, and a lot of them aren't great. But when you're a young 20 something and you're making money and you're in this place that's telling you that you're changing the world, even if you're just making a more ergonomic chair, right? It makes no sense. Then you get caught up in it all. So no, none of those things were actually pulled from my real life, but that would have been fun to experience.
Yeah, yeah, no, it definitely would have. It's, I mean, both of your books have, there's a certain element of, I don't, surrealism isn't quite the right word, but I mean, you know, obviously in Black Book, there, I guess, hyper reality, I guess it might be a slightly more appropriate term. And Alyssa, in yours as well, I mean, when no one is watching, there's also, especially near the end, sequences where it's still believable. It just kind of attains a heightened thing to it. And as you're writing, how do you sort of achieve that balance between, you know, I want to portray all these elements realistically, I want to open up this discussion, I want to illuminate these issues for people who might have no idea whatsoever what's going on, but then on the other hand, you know, you also have this creative imperative sometimes to, you know, to create these illusions, to create things, you know, in the case of Alicia's book, you know, fire and death at the end, and like, you know, kind of a very sort of surreal thing. So I'm just kind of, yeah, curious about your writerly balance when you're writing.
When I was writing this book, I really tried to focus on balancing, I guess, anxiety and humor, because you know, I was going really, a lot of it was taken from, I had written multiple historical romances set in various time points in America, and it was kind of like Sydney, being like, is anyone else seeing all of this stuff that keeps happening over and over again? And for no reason apart from people being evil and wanting to oppress other people. And so I kind of wanted to really focus on some of those things, but I didn't want it to be like trauma porn. I didn't want it to be, I wanted it to, and you know, sometimes some people have been like, oh, it's like, you know, I wanted for Black people who read it to feel seen, to feel like, okay, yes, this happens to you. No, you're not imagining it. And yes, it's unfair that it happens. And, you know, all of those little things that build up, and make you feel bad, they're real. And also here's, you know, I see you, and also here are some ways we can laugh about it, and here are some catharsis for it. For non-Black people or people who have not experienced any kind of oppression or marginalization, I wanted to like educate, but not hold their hand. I wanted to be like, okay, this is how it is. You can believe it or you cannot believe it. And a lot of people don't believe it. You know, I don't look at reviews, but I get tagged in reviews on Instagram, and people like, yeah, it was just too unbelievable. And I'm like, do you turn on the news? I won't get into all of that, but basically it is. So like you said, it's like reality, but a heightened reality. And because the book takes place over the course of a week. So everything kind of I tried to fit everything into this like time period, and also show, you know, with the pacing, you know, people have been like, it's a bit slow and then it gets really wild. And I'm like, that's how things, for me, when I was writing it, I was like, that's how things happen in life. Like everything doesn't just gradually build. A lot of times your life is normal, and then suddenly it's not normal. Then especially when something terrible happens. But I was basically trying to take all of those things that happen, microaggressions and flat out racism and structural racism and stealing of generational wealth and all these things that happen every day, and kind of compress them into this story, which by necessity makes it feel like overwhelm, especially for people who have never really read actual historical stuff about it, or even news about it, because it's often not in the news, or if it is, it's not like the front page news. And basically just tried to mix that in with some humor and, you know, entertaining stuff as well, so that it wasn't just overwhelming, but also make sure that the reader was feeling tension. And also I was tense when I was writing it. So I think that just came through in the writing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in real quick. It feels like I'm staring into a mirror in certain ways. I'm not going to lie. That sounds like almost like 85 to 90% of what Alyssa said, I were some of my own intentions and are things that I've also heard. So just real quick, just to jump in and answer as well, or to echo, I created the world of Black Buck, or I rendered the world that is very real for so many people in the workplace on the page in a way where almost anything could happen. And if you don't believe that something is happening, then that's okay, right? It's not my job to judge the reader, but you might be missing something, right? There are very wild things that take place in this workplace, as they do in the, you know, I guess non-literary or real world. But these folks, especially a lot of the people who inflict harm on my protagonist, Darren, they're young. They're in their early 20s. There are only white people in this workplace. They have a ton of money. They're always winning. They're going to the clubs. There's a lot of drinking. Of course, wild and horrifying things are going to take place. I don't know. I mean, I've been in these workplaces where I could tell you things and you would say, are you lying right now? Right. What I found with this book is that absurdity is in the eye of the beholder. There are people, like Alyssa said, who come to me and say, do Black people actually experience these types of things? Or this thing feels very fantastic, or you had me until you went to this place. And I said, well, first of all, I had Black people in mind when I wrote this book. I'm so happy whenever anyone else reads this book and takes things away from it. But I had Black people in mind, almost word for word in terms of what Alyssa said, to show people who have been in these types of scenarios that they are not paranoid, they're not overly sensitive, and they're not crazy when they perceive something to be amiss. So some of the greatest letters or emails that I get are from people who say, I read this book and I feel less alone, or to quote Alyssa, I feel seen. Then other folks say, the responses vary. That's why I'm trying to figure out which to pick. Where there are folks who say, I didn't know these types of things happened. You have illuminated them for me, even though I wasn't trying to be their tour guide. And now I have the tools to be a better ally. And then there's folks who pick and choose and say, I don't know how much of this I believe, but it really sucks if these types of things happen, right? It's on the reader at the end of the day. But I know that the world that I've rendered on the page, anything could happen. And nothing is out of the scope of reality. So that's what I was trying to do in terms of plausibility or believability, to go back to your original question, Nick. I was also looking to push the reader, I guess.
Yeah.
And I will add to that some of the things that I put in there that, you know, even beyond like the microaggressions that some people don't believe it's like that bad. Some of the things that were more fantastic, like even things that I made up later on, someone would be like, oh yeah, this is based on this situation, right? And I'm like, no, I just made that up. And yeah, it happened in real life, because, or very similar things happen in real life, because unfortunately, the world can be a terrible place sometimes. So like you were saying, like even this is basically the world, and all of these terrible things, even if they seem completely out there, are actually within reason when you look at history and even what's going on now.
Exactly.
And people were definitely, oh yeah, that was based on this case. And I was like, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And that sucks, because I thought that I made this up.
Yo, the same thing happened to me. So there's a bunch of sales teams in the organization, and I have the company name these sales teams things like Prospect Tang Clan, Lorang Hill, De La Sales, all these things, right? So I made them all up. And then a couple months later, I get an email from someone saying, hey, did you see this article where one very large company had a company retreat or camp, and they named like groups of their campers or the paths where they placed their tents after hip hop groups? I was like, nah, man, I knew nothing about that, but I'm also not surprised. And I guess the last thing I want to say on this point, just going back to what Alyssa brought up earlier, is I also wasn't looking to write 400 pages of tragedy and trauma or doom and gloom. I definitely do highlight the reality of many of our situations, but there had to be levity and humor in it, because that's just the way that my mind works. That's what I'm drawn to. But also, I thought that that would be most authentic, because I know so many different types of people, myself included, and it's not like people wake up and say, fuck, I'm black. Ugh, sucks. like that's not what it's like. You know, of course it sucks, and there's things that we go through day to day and every day. People who are non-black, or other people of color, or people who identify as women and so forth. But there is so much levity to our day-to-days, and laughter and love and triumphs, and that's the type of book that I wanted to write. So it's refreshing to hear Alyssa say the same thing.
I mean, both books had a real streak of humor in them. I mean, when no one is watching, I mean, Sydney, who, for those who haven't read the book, is one of the two protagonists, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, and then Theo, who's a new transplant. Like the interactions between them at moments, like the awkwardness and everything. I mean, I thought that was hilarious. I thought that was, and it was also sort of necessary because, again, not to spoil things, but, you know, everything with the backyard and then everything that happens kind of later in the book, it's very heavy. And so I thought that interaction is sort of like the pressure valve that happened. And Black Buck's hilarious too. I mean, they're both really funny, and you need that. I guess, I mean, and to your point about sort of trying to balance out like the heaviness and the humor, and trying to kind of create this ideal mix that really sinks into the audience's head. Both of the endings of both of your books are surprising. I mean, I definitely did not see the ending of Black Buck coming at all. And I mean, you allude to it, and then you do that nice little flip at the end where you really reveal kind of where he is. And then, you know, when no one is watching, you kind of have the sense that obviously something very bad is going to happen, but the texture and the particulars of that badness, you know, then become very clear, you know. And then I guess, so when you were writing, you don't want to sort of deliver a pat ending where like, oh, and then the issues were solved and then everyone lived happily ever after and everything is great and good. But then on the other hand, I mean, did you feel that you didn't want to sort of pile drive your audience down and say all of these issues and everything are kind of completely unsolvable? I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of where, when you were, especially as you were getting close to your endings, like how were you thinking about the balance between those polarities and trying not to sell people on like some, you know, like saccharine sweet ending that wouldn't be real?
I think for me, and I felt like I pushed it. I was like, I'm just gonna go all the way there,
It was great.
without giving any spoilers. But part of that was because I have a historical series, the Loyal League, which is Civil War espionage. And the last book in that series was like really difficult to write. And the hero in that series is a Black man who was born free. And it's kind of take on a Solomon Northup type story. And he joins this Loyal League. They are spies, Black spies who are aiding the Union. And, you know, he has PTSD. They don't know what PTSD is back then, but he has PTSD. There's something going on. And he is basically like on a road trip with this other spy. And he's like, I'm going to assassinate Jefferson Davis. And of course, you know, spoiler, at the end, he doesn't assassinate Jefferson Davis, because then that would be historical alternate universe and not historical fiction. But, you know, I was like, you know what? I really wanted him to have this. He deserved to. Okay, this is getting weird. But in the scope of that book and that character, I didn't feel that what he had been through, and I like the ending of that book that I gave him, but I was like, I feel like he deserved more, because America had really done him and all Black people dirty. And he deserved more than he got. And I was like, I really want, and I feel like, you know, there were movies and shows that have come out that have been like kind of had the promise of catharsis and then not had the catharsis. And I think, you know, forgiveness is great in some ways, but catharsis is also necessary, even if just in a book or in a movie. Because I mean, obviously we're not trying to go out and do anything terrible in real life, but sometimes and that's what fiction can be for, to kind of address this. And for me, I was like, at the end, I was like, when I was sent it to my editor, I was like, wonder what she's gonna say about this. And she was just like, okay, it's great, cool. And I was happy with that. But like, I really kind of wanted to be in Sydney, and you know, other characters would do other things in those situations, but to someone who, like a Black woman who has been in a mental health crisis for a while, is being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and at the end, what happens when you keep pushing someone that far when all they're doing is trying to, you know, get through the day. And so for me, that ending was, you know, and that I think is a universal thing of people who are just tired of, you know, being stepped on. And what happens when, and for me, I was kind of thinking a bit of like falling down, but except someone who like had actual issues and not just was like upset because with their job and stuff. But so kind of, you know, I feel like there are a lot of movies like that that are catharsis for things like that. And certain people get catharsis and certain people don't. So I was like, okay, I kind of want to delve a bit more deeply into this and try to balance it with not being too out there and not pushing too far in the past the morally gray area, but also like really addressing that some stories need to have endings that are surprising or take certain turns.
I thought it was interesting because, I mean, when you read the reviews, you know, I read the Goodreads and the Amazon reviews, so you don't have to. But I mean, you know, like all these people who have read the book say, you know, I Get Out as a reference that they allude to in Hitchcock's Rear Window, obviously. But I mean, Falling Down is definitely not the one I expected to hear. But now that you're mentioning it, it actually totally fits, where somebody's just like completely pushed with good reason, and you're, you know, exactly. Michael Douglas in that movie had zero reason whatsoever to snap off, but Sydney definitely does. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, her entire life has just been sort of dealing with this crap. And so, yeah, no, and it works kind of character-wise. In terms of Black Book, also when I was reading all the Amazon and Goodreads reviews, I mean, people make allusions to sorry to bother you and things like that. And I wasn't sure that quite fit. So I was wondering, when you were writing the book, in terms of like literary influences, Mateo, what were you, I mean, kind of what were the fiction books that were sort of most strongly sort of pulling you in, or that you were kind of looking at maybe as a model or a framework or just inspiration?
Yeah, I think people, you know, bring up Sorry to Bother You because it's the only example they can point to of a Black man picking up a phone, right? Like I never have really called it that. I get it and I respect it. I actually had a conversation with Boots Riley once while I was writing this book. I saw him at McNally Jackson, and I just sort of like, it was verbal diarrhea, scarcity mindset. And when I heard about your film, I was like, what? I'm writing this book and blah, 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 blah. And my man just looks at me, he's like, are you okay? He doesn't say that, but he looked at me like that. What he really said was like, hey, I got some like pre-screening coming up. I can get you on the list. I said, I'm already on the list. I'll see you there. But for me, I had read The Sellout. I think just before, I don't know exactly, remember when I read it in relation to Black Buck. It was definitely before I wrote it. It could have been months, could have been a year. I don't exactly remember, but I remember reading it and saying, this shit is crazy. And not only is it crazy, but it won the Man Booker Prize and it was published. What? Like, you can write books like this that go so overboard, and again, blur so many lines. So I read that and I felt as though I had the permission to write the book that I wanted to, even though I knew I had to be able to pull it off. So The Sellout was definitely one. And then I began reading heavily of other Black writers that many of us just don't hear about, right? We hear about Toni Morrison, of course. We hear about James Baldwin, of course, Langston Hughes, sometimes Zora Neale Hurston. maybe a couple others, Richard Wright, but we often don't hear about in Petrie or Chester Himes or Charles Johnson or John A. Williams, Charles Wright. John A. Williams, for me, when I read The Angry Ones, which was published, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like between the 50s and the 70s, I believe. I said, whoa, I'm writing something that feels original to me, but now I know that it's part of a larger tradition and a longer tradition. So those types of books just inspired me to go further, to go deeper, to create fearlessly, or if I did have any fear or trepidation, then to push through it. And by the time that I wrote Black Buck, I didn't really have a lot of hesitancy because I had written 2 manuscripts that didn't go anywhere, didn't get an agent, didn't get a book deal. So I said, F this, now I'm just going to write the book that I want. And Black Buck, I did what I wanted with it. And unfortunately, it resonated.
Was the path to publication kind of, I mean, no path to publication is an easy path to publication, but in terms of Black Buck, was it because you had written these 2 manuscripts and, you know, went on agent submission and so on and didn't get picked up, and then this book gets picked up? Did you find that there was kind of like a hunger for the story that you were telling, or did it take more time than you expected to kind of fully get picked up? I mean, just how did that whole journey go?
Yeah, there was a hunger. There was no real pushback. Of course, you get rejections. Like a bunch of editors rejected it. It's not like every agent that I queried signed it,
Yeah.
but I got a few offers of representation, and I went with the agent who just it felt as though she were in my mind, and she said, Mateo, this reads like a sales manual. I almost fell. I was like, what? Like, are you bugging me? What do you mean? Are you in my head? When she said that, I said, okay, she's the one. It's not like I signed immediately, had to do my due diligence, then give other people their time, but went with her. And then we spent around 5 to 6 months, working on the book, and had some early readers, got some good notes from them. And then when we went out on sub with editors, again, it's not like every editor wanted it. It got rejections, but there were a handful interested. And then the first person I spoke with from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, my current publisher, I just saw how much she got it. I saw the enthusiasm. I saw, to use the word that you use, Nick, the hunger. So we signed, and then the whole publisher was behind it. And, fortunately, it seems as though many people get the book, but then of course, you read the Amazon and Goodreads reviews. Like Alyssa, I haven't read those in months. And some people don't get it, but it's okay, because the people I originally had in mind, and even people beyond it, it's resonating with them, and it's doing what I wanted to do. So I'm grateful.
Do you both think that over the past year, especially, that publishers have been sort of genuinely kind of more open to embracing own voices and diverse perspectives and sort of different manuscripts than before? I mean, obviously, in terms of publishing becoming more diverse and so on, it's, as what happened with American Dirt and everything, it's a slow progression, and there's setbacks and things like that. But do you think that there's genuine change that's sort of going on among publishers with all of this?
I think there is, but okay, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. So when I first started trying to get published, and also that was within romance, which has its own other race issue. There's the general publishing race issue, and then the issue of race plus love and perceptions of who is lovable and who has deeply felt relationships, and things that people don't like talking about when they just want to say this doesn't resonate. But I dropped my phone. We're going to leave that there. But publishing, I think, has slowly been changing, but I think overall, unfortunately, it's an industry that is a slow changing industry. We still, even if you think about production, it's still, sometimes they act like, and I worked in publishing, not fiction publishing. I used to work at a science journal. And, they treat the production process sometimes like they're still using a printing press, and someone is crawling up there and making the changes that they have to make a big deal about it, not like someone's just changing a PDF. So I think that plus institutional racism has made for like very slow change. But I do think it's changing. I do think this year has been a kind of shifting turning point, in part because of the publishing paid me hashtag that was paired with the summer of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and people really being unable to really avoid having to think about race and how race and Blackness and how it affects people's daily lives. And a lot of people had never really thought about the fact that, a lot of people on some level were like, well, maybe the book just wasn't good enough. Because publishing is hard for everyone. So people will be like, I get rejected and I'm white. And so, there sometimes is the level of even people who are supportive are like, was it really because of your race? Or was it just because the book wasn't good? Because I have like 50 rejections and I'm white and I'm not just getting automatically published. So I think some people within publishing and, authors, but people who are also in charge of acquisitions are starting to really understand, like, examine their biases a bit maybe. And when you're confronted with, okay, here are all of these people on Twitter, and here are all of these Black authors that you thought were making a lot of money and they're not. And here are a bunch of white authors who have no idea who they are and they're making a lot of money. Things like that, even if it's just anecdotal, started turning the gears in some people's heads, like, maybe this isn't a meritocracy somehow magically when the rest of the world isn't a meritocracy either. And so I do think things are changing. I hope things continue to change, but I feel like one of the things that I do know is that, within romance and having gone back and looked at historical things, you can always go back and find interviews with people and they're like, yeah, things are changing with Black authors who are advocating or, authors from other marginalized groups and things. So things are changing. But if someone in 1982 thought that things were changing for the better, and still here we are now, and things are still changing. So I think things are changing, but there needs to be like a sea change, like a massive change, and not just slow change, not trickle change.
How do you unlock that sea change? Can that sea change be unlocked? Can it be done relatively, given how slow it is? Publishing is super slow. Can it be done?
I think it can be done, but it's the same issue that publishing is a microcosm of America. I do think the past year there has been like a leap ahead because so many people some people actually started thinking about things more deeply, and other people started thinking about more money, like, oh, okay, we can make more money if we do this, which, fine, if that's what it's going to take for people to acquire other authors, that's a start for getting the foot in the door. But as for overall change, it's the same thing when you think about America. How do you make this change a radical change?
Yeah, I mean, Alyssa's just hitting on so much. I think that there's a real difference between the cosmetic and the structural. And we are so often inundated with the cosmetic that we believe that the foundation is changing when it's actually not. I'm an optimist, and I do see things trending in a way that are hopeful, right? We have more Black and brown folk in editorial positions, especially this year and last year. We've seen many different changes. And that's great because you need people in those acquisition meetings, right? Which is where the magic happens. Even if an editor, and this is just for the folks in the audience, because everyone here knows that, but even if an editor likes your book, has to go through P&L and publicity and all these different people because it's a business. So Nick, when you start off and you bring up American Dirt, they're having the last laugh because that book was a hit. Like in financial.
Yeah, outside of Twitter, like everyone kind of on Twitter was like, and social media was upset. But outside of social media, yeah, it was a hit. And even that, it was a mess. But I think on some level, they really thought that they were doing so. Like they thought it was a diverse book, and they're like, oh, we're really backing this diverse, it was, we're not going to, litigate the whole American Dirt thing. But I think on some level, their response was like, but we have this diverse author and we're supporting this book. And why is everyone mad at us? but so yeah, but to go to what Mateo was saying, I do think the structural change needs to happen, but it also needs to, like, you can't just have a couple of people. It just kind of goes to your book. Like, if you only have a few, like one Black person,
Yep.
they bear the burden of all of the change.
Yep.
And they take on so much more work, and also the work of bringing other people in. And that really wears down on people who are put in that position. So I think, you know, we need to think about authors, but also the people who are bought in, you know, starting from internships, which should be paid up. But also, like, you're really just going to have to bring in, like, and, you know, thinking about your book and how people were upset because all of the new hires were, you know, trying to think if that's a spoiler or not, but, you know, it does change it then goes to the idea of who is a fit in the workplace, that, you know, because I remember even when I was working at my publisher, and like, I was the only Black person in production. There were other Black people who worked at the company, but, you know, there was this, when I was reading your book, I thought about it, because there was this moment of whenever they were hiring someone new, and the people, you know, my boss and the supervisor, they would be like, talk about it afterwards, and they would like, one thing, like, talking about like who would be fun to go drinking with.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
not a culture fit.
What do you think this is? We are like reading papers about cancer research. Like, like, why are you acting like this is like some hip cool job that this person needs to fill? Can they edit? Do they know what a comma is? But like, so when people think, you know, in your book, it's specifically the tech startup and this kind of fast-paced world, but it really goes down to like any place you can think of will have their idea of who is a cultural, you know, the right cultural fit. So people have to examine that too, because if you're going to say, oh, someone who's fun to go drink with, I was like, I don't want to drink with you. Like, I'm not a good cultural fit, and I've worked here for years. But so, like, you know, things like that, people in publishing are going, you know, among the many things, and also bringing in multiple people at once, and not just, okay, we'll have a diversity initiative and bring in one or two people, because you're just kind of putting them on an island, and like, you know, with a little deflated volleyball, and telling them to use it to change the publishing industry as a whole, when it's not their job.
You end up being Tom Hanks with Wilson. You know, Nick, I don't want to belabor the point. I couldn't agree more with honestly everything that Alyssa said. Like, the sea change takes place with getting so many people in, so that you don't point to a bunch of tokens and say, look, progress. At the same time, and this is going to get like a little existential or spiritual, I think people need to change their hearts first and say, why do I actually even believe that we should change our business, especially if it's made us money in the past? Are we only going to change? Are we only going to start acquiring more books by Black and brown folks because people are threatening to cancel us if we don't? Are we just going to do it to make more money? Or do I actually believe in me being the person at the top, or one of the people in those meetings, or many of them in those meetings, saying, do I actually believe that we need to publish these other stories? I mean, I don't want to speak for Alyssa, but I would say for us, no doubt, because a lot of the shit that's been published up until this point, it's been cool, but some of it's just boring as hell. It's like the same plot where it's like Candy and Helen both move to New York City when they're 22, and then DeMarco enters their life, and who's DeMarco gonna pick? I'm not trying to belittle those types of books, but they come out every year because there's a market for them and people enjoy them. But there is a large market for books by Black and brown folk, and not even always just for Black and brown folk.
Yeah, and I will say to that even in books like that, it's hard to publishing is often reluctant to buy them from non-cis cishet white authors. And I think, just, and like you said, it is kind of does get existential, but you need to people need to understand that Black and brown people are humans with complex inner lives, and like it sounds, but once you take it from there, then everything else makes sense, because the only way that everything as it is right now makes sense is if you understand that our society has in a way just dehumanized so many people.
Yep.
And that Black people, Asian people, as we're
Yep.
seeing right now, trans people, as we're seeing right now,
Mhm.
because dehumanization makes it easier for you to say, okay, yes, I'm going to pass a law that hurts you, or I'm going to like smack you upside the head in the street because it's a game, and things like that. And like, of course someone would say, yes, that's a human being, but there's a difference between knowing someone is a human being and knowing that they're a human, like,
Ooh.
and that they have thoughts and feelings. So I think that's, and we can't control that for other people. We can talk about it, we can exist. I mean, it should be obvious, I feel like, but sadly, a lot of obvious things don't get done.
Mm.
Both of your books do that so masterfully. I mean, you both in different but related ways. Like you both, I mean, people describe people who are in these silos, these gentrifiers, these people who are running these startups and so on. And they don't think of themselves as evil, and they don't think of what they're doing as bad, but they're stuck in this mentality or this headspace where they do these horrible, horrible things, and there's no mechanism for them to sort of realize that even what they're doing is bad. And that's sort of, in a way, that's more terrifying than, for example, in the case of When No One Is Watching, if the villain was sort of self-aware and outright. I mean, there's something, the obliviousness and the ignorance is horrifying in and of itself, in a way that's like kind of just like toe curling.
Yeah. And I think it's just so normalized that it's normal. It is normal. They're not incorrect.
Yeah.
Which is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, like Nick, what you're bringing up is relatability, because that lack of self-awareness, there are people that read our books and see those characters, and at least with mine, I intentionally created many of these characters in this manner where people would read it and say, what did this character do that was wrong? I don't get it. This is how I think. This is what I believe in as well. Even a character such as Clyde, I wanted to write him in a way where some people would look at him and say, I don't disagree with anything that he did or said.
Which is horrifying, that there would be people, I mean, from my perspective, that there would be people out there who'd be like, oh yeah, this guy's fine. He's totally fine. Or like, at the very beginning of the book, like when he is being sort of brought into the company and everything, like the incident with the paint, I'm not trying to spoil too much, et cetera, like stuff like that. Like I was just like viscerally horrified when I read that. But I mean, and the fact that the idea that there would be people out there who would sort of read that and be like, oh yeah, this is totally fine, whatever, just another Tuesday. I mean, it's just like, it's not good, but that's yeah.
And I guess this is, something that both books kind of touch on, maybe not explicitly, or maybe not, I don't know if I was even thinking about it when writing, but like the fact that like, just one of the reasons that so many terrible things happen is that it's easier to pretend that they're not happening. Mm-hmm. It's easier to think this terrible thing that happened must be a one-off. There must be some extenuating circumstance why, this person did this, or when in reality, it's like much more common than we would like, than most people would like to acknowledge. But unless we acknowledge that, some of these terrible things are the norm, then they can't really be changed.
Yeah, both of your books do a really good job at showing how, for, that whole process, that people, it's sort of like all the gentrifiers in your book, like they're so oblivious, and the whole society around them is structured so that they never have to confront it directly. Or all the people who work like, at a startup at the top of, Rockefeller Center or whatever, like they don't have to actually do any of the sort of dirty work themselves. The society has already been structured to allow all that to happen. And that's also kind of systemically, that's another horrifying thing that I think both books do a really good job of illuminating, like just how this is just such a structural problem that people who aren't aware of it just, as we've been saying, don't even realize, like, sort of, this is what's happening. Yeah, no, so I mean, it was both of these books. I don't usually get like a very visceral reaction books, but both of these books gave me like that visceral reaction. I thought that was a really just amazing thing.
Alyssa, building off of what Nick was just saying, that reaction, what was your emotional state while you were writing your book? I mean, maybe it changed throughout it, but yeah, I'm curious.
I actually wrote most of it like in a fugue state. So I don't remember. I had been doing the research and planning everything out, and I had like, of course, the first chapters, and like I was just kind of stuck. And then finally, it just all was like, okay, time to go. So I kind of was just in it. But I think one reason, and I have talked about this before, I didn't think about it while writing it, but one of the reasons I feel like I was able to write it is because I wasn't living in Brooklyn. I wasn't in the United States. Because I live in the Caribbean. I live on an island that is majority Black. And there is just such a, everything's not amazing. No, I don't really think there's anywhere in the world that, government is amazing and everything's amazing. But I feel like one thing that I noticed was after I moved here was like, okay, there was a certain level of anxiety that disappeared. Like when I go into a store, no one's following me. I can go in my bag to get my phone. I don't feel like a security guard's gonna be like up on my back. I don't know, there's just a certain level that I was not aware of until I moved. And I lived in New York. Like it wasn't like, which can be like, as we saw, the book can be a very racist place. People try to do that whole, okay, only the South is like that. No, all of America has issues with this. But and I think it's just this weird, for me, it's not my exact emotional state while writing the book, but the state that led me to be able to write it was not having this kind of pressure that I had been so used to kind of pushing down on me, that I think would have made it really much more difficult to write the book if I had to write about some of those things and then go outside and experience it. So it was a little easier to kind of just like get it out of my system. And it was a little, cathartic in a way for me. Like, I was very anxious and tense at particular parts, but overall I was like, this is like something that's sitting on me and I need to get it off of that weight off of me.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear, because I've always thought, okay, if I'm going to write a novel set in a certain place, I need to be there, especially like New York. Like I want to be tapped in to that, like almost drug-like feeling you feel when you touch down or you come back to New York and you're like, hustle. Or like, everyone's working, and it's anxiety too. You brought up anxiety. It's this anxiety of like, am I doing enough? Everyone here is doing so much. When we could go out pre-COVID, the first question people ask is, what do you do? Right. It's just like, or depending on your scenario, but I think in a lot of places in New York, what do you do? Where do you work? And so forth. And sometimes or oftentimes that can be crushing. But it's like a double-edged sword, because I also thrive off of it myself in terms of my energy. But when I leave New York, I sleep a lot for the first couple of days of like wherever I am. When I leave New York City, I originally grew up, I lived in Brooklyn. I've lived all over Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn now, but I originally grew up on Long Island, right? So even if I go to Long Island and I visit my parents and I sleep there for a couple of days, I feel like I'm in a completely different place. My wavelength has changed. Then when I get back to the city, everything is different. So it's encouraging to know that you wrote your book when you were out of Brooklyn then, and you were still able to capture it in the way that you wanted to.
Yeah, and I did go back and visit, that was probably one of the reasons I was having a little hold up with my being able to write. I did go back right before I was finally able to sit down and get everything out and walk around the neighborhood. I visited my old neighborhood and I walked around. I went to the Weeksville Heritage Center, which is in the book, and it's a real place. And kind of just remembered all of the rhythms and the things that I wanted to capture on the page, I guess.
Nice. Cool. So last question, what are you both working on now?
Silence.
I know, total silence. I mean, I hate it when people ask me that question, but I figured I'm just intrigued. I mean, after you both had these spectacular blowout successes and these amazing books, how do you follow it up? I mean, that's.
I am actually working on a graphic novel
Cool.
with an amazing artist and illustrator named O'Neill Jones. And it's, I've always been obsessed with comic books since I was a kid, and manga and anime. And in one of my previous books, the characters meet and they bond over an anime that I made up for the book. And people were like, oh, is that going to be a real thing? And I was like, that would be cool. And it was just like, I was working with this artist whose work I loved. And I was like, I'm just going to make like a short comic for my readers who enjoyed it. And then she came back with these amazing character designs. And I was like, okay, maybe we can see if something more can be done with this, because like her artwork is just so incredible. And I felt like it would be ridiculous to just kind of be like, I mean, I was like, I feel like you deserve better than me just being like, okay, here are these 3 pages. So it's called, for now, Reject Squad, and it's like a sleeping beauty at a military high school fantasy fun YA. It's YA.
Oh, that sounds so cool.
That's so cool. I'm just super inspired right now from hearing you be like, I was just going to write in this different medium and get it out. I mean, that's definitely what I want to do as well. I am working on another book, so trying to carve out time for that now. I've just been in promo mode for the last couple of months, like full time. It's a full job. But yeah, I'm looking to just carve out more time for this other project. And then when more things pop up down the line, paying attention there, and gearing up for the UK release of Black Book in May.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. This was this was illuminating for me, and it was great to finally meet you both after reading your amazing books.
Same.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Mateo, Alyssa, and Nick, thank you. That was a phenomenal discussion. Nick, thanks for facilitating this conversation. And Alyssa and Mateo, congratulations on your respective great works. We appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today, and we wish you continued great success.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss any of it. Please go to our website, Gaithersburgbookfestival.org, and look over the schedule so that you can plan your festival month. But before you go, we have a special message for you from the amazing author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.